if one were to reflect a bit, it's also clear that during this pandemic, one of the things that became visible in our own situation was that there was not much recognition of the roles of the informal food sector as a vibrant market and the informal sector players as key distributing networks for food to our communities.
There's this repeated message from small-scale farmers across the country around not just needing production support, and we've heard this a few times today, but really looking at market opportunities and how can these be reconfigured.
In South Africa, the impact of climate crisis is going to be hotter and drier conditions, drought, and extreme weather events. And it's going to become more difficult to produce maize and wheat, which are two staples. So we've got to be able to think about how we're going to respond to this thing. And essentially, the response has to be greater diversity as one component of that.
In South Africa, however, high levels of corporate concentration, as highlighted in the previous presentation, as well as de-agrarianization, marked by shifts from field to garden cultivation and increasingly few households owning larger herds of livestock, on the other hand, makes South Africa's agri-food system particularly vulnerable in this pandemic.
What we really learned is that, from the agricultural perspective at least, that with the existence and the clear policies and regulation in place, it is able to really drive the market players and enable the market players in the sector to build resilience and to maintain competitive conduct and to grow their business operations. And we've seen this during the COVID because of the regulation that we put in place, which supported the agriculture to continue operating and doing their businesses. And in most numbers that we have seen at the macroeconomic indicators really show that agriculture was supported by regulation, and we managed to be able to be a sector that is still resilient in comparing with our economic sectors. If you look at the trade data that it came out in the last 3 months, if you're looking also in terms of your economic growth into that sector, clearly shows that with regulation, it allows the players to be able to build that resilience.
People who benefited from the systems are those who are well established. For instance, you find that retail shops and commercial farmers, as guided by the policy, were the people who were able to be within the system, who get to provide the food that was being provided at grassroots level, taking into account that the policy did not have room for your informal traders or subsistence farmers to also get a share within being part of the relief system in terms of now being actively involved in food supply during the pandemic.
The pandemic did point out some limitations of the commercial response to food security, not only during the pandemic, but also in normal times. I mean, if we start right at the most basic side, which is that the food system should be delivering as efficiently and effectively as possible food to every person every day. But if in the pandemic, 50% of people have been going hungry, which is shocking. I mean, this is like an emergency that we should be, every waking moment should be concerned, especially those of us working in the food sector. What do we do about this thing?
Unfortunately, the opening up of the economy is not going to restore incomes and those supply chains for the vast majority of the population in poor townships and rural communities across the country. However, what this moment is highlighting, both for policy and further research, is the need for us to better understand the food procurement strategies and diets of low-income households, of low-income and poor households.
It has become very clear during the COVID-19 lockdown that continuing to say South Africa is food secure at the national level, which continues to be the case, might not be sufficient going forward, as there's a need to start making sure that you provide even food and affordable food, for that matter, at the household level.
The pandemic has also shown that small-scale food system actors can and actually do, in some instances, play a very critical role in our food system despite this corporate domination. So the minister did refer, for example, to informal traders. I mean, it's been quite amazing to see the major negative impact on food security as a result of closing those channels for food distribution into townships and informal settlements that happened in the level 5 lockdown.
As also previously highlighted by the other speakers, informal food systems play a significant role in facilitating food access to poor and vulnerable people. The informal sector provides food in affordable unit sizes, provides food on credit, sells fresh produce at lower costs than what is available in most supermarket fresh produce sections, and sells prepared foods appropriate for households that experience income, time, storage, and energy poverty. So these dynamics, what this pandemic has highlighted really is how these dynamics need to be further understood and also taken into account in planning and policy thinking around food security. And as I will highlight later also, for the most part, our food security policy has focused on the production side, and there's little mention of how the food system in its entirety functions.
And how can we also promote food safety and security by adjusting the prices of food commodities that contain good nutritional content so that it is accessible to all, given that keeping a healthy diet is quite expensive.
Policy perspective as we go towards the future and try to really reposition the state, working with social partners to be able to reconstruct and regrow the sector beyond the COVID crisis, is that it is important before we start talking about policy reforms, we start understanding the evolution of the policies that we have in our table and the impact thereof that they've had into our sector. Because that then will allow us to be able to be clear about the blind spot of not creating other policies that are just perpetuating the status quo and not really bringing meaningful change into the sector. But also you bring in policies and redesign them in areas where you feel they have led to and not achieved the intended goals that it is.
Now, if we cast our mind to the future, if we think about how we could make things more resilient, it seems to make sense also to add, okay, first of all, to build up the capabilities of fresh produce farmers, fishers, to actually produce a greater volume that can be circulated locally, but also to think about processing, small-scale processing in localities that could support also the distribution of other food products, not only fresh produce.
Furthermore, the social and cultural structures that underpin and shape smallholder farming groups and/or communities are increasingly characterized by significant fluidity and functional diversity. Firstly, smallholder farmer households are not static. They are spatially stretched between rural and urban spaces and livelihoods. And secondly, the notion of smallholder farmer households as cohesive production units is challenged by deviations from cultural expectations and discrepancies between rules and practice.
So if we need a complete rethink on this and to build from the ground, there is also the question emerging of what is the role of agroecology in this rethinking and rebuilding?
The right to food should mean the right to have nutritionally adequate, socially and culturally appropriate, healthy and safe food each and every day for each and every person living in this country.
So while the right to food is recognized in the Constitution, we don't have specific legislation on the right to food, and it's not also adequately reflected in the policies that we currently have in place.